Good, okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to you all. Sorry to cut you short by a minute. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The first, and probably not the most important, but something just to bear in mind, please check your cell phone. And if you are determined to leave it on, could I ask you to do two things? Set the volume low and tune it to Fine Music FM. The second thing is, I've just been accused of moving my head a little bit too much, and the microphone is position sensitive. So please, I will not be remotely offended if somebody shouts out, "Speak up!" Then at least I know there's a problem and I will do my best to remedy it. Very frustrating for you, I know, if you can't hear what's being said. Okay, well, if we're ready, let's get underway. Shall we turn the lights down? Sorry, do you want to adjust that a little bit there? That's better. And please, I really mean that. Do raise a hand and say, do speak up or something, because we're all in this together. Well, it's good to see you again, and thank you for sticking it out for 4 solid days. Yesterday we met William Turner, whose immersion in the forces of nature paved the way to Impressionism and abstraction. Today we're going to meet Paul Cézanne, whose art was more subtle, but whose effect on subsequent generations of artists was arguably more profound. He was a solitary figure, rejected by his peers, whose lifelong quest was to tease out the underlying structure of the subject before him, whether here in his own face, or here in bathers by the bank of a river, or in his paintings, of which he did more than 60, of Mont Sainte-Victoire in his beloved Provence, all of which resulted ultimately in paintings which are immensely satisfying. Together with his still lifes, in which he experimented with perspective, this analytical approach opened the eyes of subsequent generations of painters to entirely new ways of thinking and of seeing. And this is his legacy. He's not an in-your-face Renoir or an in-your-face Turner, if I may use those terms. It's subtle, but it's more intellectual. And I have to say that for me, this was the most challenging talk to prepare. And for you, as members of the audience, I think it's going to be the most challenging of the series as well. So I'll ask you to be patient, and it builds up slowly to see where he was coming from and what he finally achieved and what his legacy really was. So what do we know about this man? Well, he was born in the then very sleepy little town of Aix-en-Provence, very much in the shadow of his dominating father. His father was a powerful force on him, and Cézanne lived in his father's shadow for the first half of his life. There, even when he's absent, in this painting of his mother, who was Cézanne's emotional support for all her life, doing her knitting there on the sofa in the family living room, there is one of his 2 younger sisters at the piano. His father is still present in the form of that floral-covered easy chair. He, at the age of 14, entered the Lycée Bourbon in Aix, and there he befriended this young man, Émile Zola, and the two of them for many, many years were almost like brothers. In fact, so much so that the 2 boys, plus another young man, Jean Baye, regarded themselves as the only 3 intelligent boys in the school, which consisted entirely of otherwise duffers. Cézanne and Zola were linked also by family heritage, insofar as both families had recently moved to France from Italy. So what about father, who played such an important role psychologically in Cézanne? Here he is, a self-made man, started out as a buyer and exporter of felt hats, but soon made enough money to take an equal share in Aix's only bank, and now a banker. He had little time for nonsense, as you can probably guess from this painting that Cézanne did of his father a few years later. But he indulged his son's interest in drawing by allowing him to take some classes while still at school at the Aix School of Design and Painting and of Art. And there he developed his art, but father enrolled him at the age of 19 without even any consultation, as far as I can tell, in Aix University Law Faculty, so that his son could become a lawyer and then work in his bank. That was the idea. When Cézanne came to paint this picture of his father when he was in his early 20s, he did so in a most interesting way. Here's his father sitting down, no nonsense, tight-lipped, getting on with his newspaper. But the newspaper he chose to put in his hand was L'Avènement, which was the most liberal newspaper in the south of France at the time. It's a newspaper his father not only vowed he would never, ever subscribe to, but never even read. Furthermore, look at the picture at the back there, behind the chair, and that's a painting by Cézanne. And to my mind, this is Cézanne appealing to his father for understanding. Father had grand ambitions. He'd now arrived. He was a banker in the town, and he purchases a derelict house, large house with 37 acres of land just outside the town of Aix, known as Jas de Bouffin, which just means the wind. And he purchased that. It was the derelict house of the former governor of the province. It was in a rundown state, and he spends a lot of time and money getting it restored. And he allows his son Cézanne, Paul, to paint 4 10-foot tall panels in the salon. And here he does so. He's in his early 20s now. And here he paints spring on the left there, summer, winter, and on the right, autumn. And interestingly, he signs the painting Ingres, the name of the great classic 19th century French master of classicism. A little bit arrogant, ironical, if you like. When he was at the academy, the drawing school at Aix, he chanced to meet another intelligent young man. Here he is painted, but he's quite a bit older with some grey hair, but they were much the same age. And this was Achille Empereur, who also was interested in painting. And he was a very bright, alert man, but he was physically stunted with wasted legs, as you can see there. And he paints his friend a little later in life with a play on his name, Empereur, Emperor. And he poses him in his father's floral-covered chair. There he is in his carpet slippers, resting on a wooden box because his feet are so short. Very much in the style of Ingres, who painted Napoleon's coronation portrait here, although the difference here, the only difference here being, of course, that Napoleon is wearing golden slippers with jewels and is resting his feet on a silk cushion. Having got his law degree, he was working at the bank, starting at the bottom as a clerk. And as the months went by, it was increasingly apparent that Paul was becoming very frustrated with this, and his intimidating father had to be approached. So rather than approach his father directly to say, I want a career as an artist, he wrote to his friend Zola, who was now in Paris, starting his own career as a writer. He wrote saying, I'm in a dilemma. And one of the characteristics of Cézanne throughout his life was his uncertainty and lack of confidence in himself, and his tendency to collapse whenever he met any sort of obstacle. And he wrote to saying, Zola, dear Paul, what should I do? And Zola, Emile, what should I do? And Zola wrote back, do not dither. Either become a proper lawyer or a serious painter, not an undecided creature in a paint-splattered robe. You can see the literary skills there. Anyway, a year has to go by for Cézanne to persuade his father to allow him to go to Paris to become an artist, and he works through his mother. Mother's the one who does all the negotiating, and eventually he acquiesces on a very small survival pittance on one understanding, that he works hard with his painting in order to gain entry to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts. in order that he can get a diploma from the école and then earn his living as an art teacher. So that was the thinking. So he arrives in Paris, Zola's there to greet him, they stay together, and Zola says to him, sensible man that he is, he says, in order to get into the Beaux-Arts, you've got to have a body of work. Painting doors in Aix is not going to do it. So he enrolls him in one of the many private academies for budding young artists in Paris, and this happened to be an academy run by Charles Suisse. There he does some work, and together with Zola, they go to the Louvre and have a look so that he can get ideas for his painting. And there he comes across this still life by Chardin, the master of still life from the 18th century, which young Cézanne greatly admires. And then he goes back to his studio and he does this. And I think what's so interesting was that the way Chardin had that, let me just quickly put it back, I didn't draw your attention to it, the way the cloth hangs over the edge there, do you see? And that's what caught his eye. And so it's a little bit left-handed, but for a first attempt, it's really not at all bad. 2 baguettes, a couple of onions, a couple of eggs, a tankard and a glass and a knife. What more could you want? And Cézanne looks at this and he gives him a nod. He doesn't say too much because he's got to find his own way, but he gives him a nod of approval. And now Cézanne really feels encouraged. He puts his own still life together this time, not copying anybody, but he just gathers what he can find, a block, he puts a tablecloth out, he arranges a clamshell sort of bowl there, a cup and saucer, a lemon you can see, and interestingly this black marble clock without any hands. I'm not sure the significance of that and of ours. But just looking at that picture objectively, it seems more an exercise in verticals and horizontals than anything else. So he's feeling his way about how to structure a canvas. And then off to the Louvre again, and this time they see this marvelous work by Eugène Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, French Revolution, the tricolour there, the brilliant red at the top, bodies at the bottom there, the beginning of Romanticism, quite different from the paintings that Ingres was doing at the time. This was a revolutionary work which caught young Cézanne's eye, and he works on that as a model to do something in his own style, which is this. Interesting. There we have not Liberty raising her arm holding the tricolour with her bare breasts, but we have a totally nude woman holding a drape over her head. And instead of the red of the tricolour there, we have the red of the devil who's egging on the figure sitting on a stone there with his eyes cowered from this nude figure, St. Antoni. And he calls this the temptation of St. Antoni. And he submits this, together with his other still lifes that he's done and other things, to the École des Beaux-Arts for his admission qualification, which is rejected. And the rejection letter says to him that he is unconventional and messy. And that's how he's right. So he's a bit crestfallen with that, and then goes into a bit of a trough. And as a consequence of going into that trough, he does some black paintings, rather like Goya did towards the end of his life. They look very similar. A whole series of them. One was a murder victim at night on a street. You can just see streaks of blood. And here, a violent rape scene. And Cézanne is losing confidence in himself. Furthermore, Zola is now fully preoccupied writing his second novel, and he hasn't got as much time for Paul as he had in the past. And so he returns back to Aix, tail between his legs, and resumes working as a clerk at his father's bank. He sticks it for a year and then contacts Zola again. Here is Zola again. And he contacts his friend again, who tells him to come back, give it a go, although secretly Zola doubted whether Cézanne had the temperament to be a successful artist because of this gnawing self-doubt that paralyzed him every time he met an obstacle. But he goes back to the École Suisse, Atelier Suisse, continues with his work, submits the work again to the École des Beaux-Arts, which is again rejected. So while he's working there, he doesn't give up, he's going to stay there. He's not going to go back twice to be humiliated by his father a second time, so he sticks it out. And just before, while he's sticking it out, Zola does give him time to do his own portrait. And here's Zola sitting on a mattress, and there is his friend another writer who's reading to him an article that he's just written. But again, rejected a second time from the Beaux-Arts. Who should come in to the École, the Atelier Suisse, to see what was going on is our friend Camille Pissarro, you remember. And Pissarro's great human quality was that he was not remotely jealous of anybody. He regarded his role in life to be a mentor to young artists. And he wanted to seek out these young artists, and he went round the various private ateliers and to see who was who. And he saw Cézanne, and he said, let me introduce you to some young artists who I think you'll get on with, and I think you're going to make it. Stick at it. And who were the young artists Pissarro introduced him to? Edouard Manet. Here, dapper, the leader of the group, in a silk top hat there, black waistcoat, black jacket, silver-tipped cane, as you can see. And in his little circle of friends, of course, was Degas, Renoir, and Monet. And through Pissarro's intervention, Cézanne was introduced to these people. They looked at him as a provincial fellow with a very strong Provençal accent, rather gruff in manner, which Pissarro had already cautioned them about. And the group said, come and join us. We meet every Wednesday afternoon and Thursday afternoon at the Café Gaubois, where we discuss art, and you're very welcome to come and join us. And Cézanne did so for a while, but then felt that he was an odd man out here with his accent, his manner. They were a little bit sort of shifty with him and didn't pay too much attention to what he had to say. And so he sort of drifted away from the group. The group, meanwhile, were, of course, the stars of the future, but nobody knew that because all their works were rejected by the Grand Salon, where, of course, you had to establish your reputation. So the group, realizing they had something to offer the world of art, but the critics really condemning everything they did and never even getting their canvases as far as the wall of the Grand Salon, they appealed to the Emperor Napoleon III, because in order to have a salon, it had to have the royal imprimatur. And they were successful, and Napoleon III granted a salon to be known as the Salon des Indépendants, the independent salon, colloquially known as the Salon des Refusés, the rejected ones. And there, Cézanne is invited to submit a couple of his canvases, as they all do. The first salon took place in 1863, and the critics absolutely panned it, and the public that came laughed at all the works that were there. The sensation, the scandal of that first salon was not Cézanne, but the scandal was Edouard Monet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. I'm sure you know the work, two naked women in a picnic with men dressed in their finery, and this was a scandal. But interestingly, the critic Stock, known by the name of Stock, who was also a painter, chose to satirize in this caricature not Manet, I think he was a bit intimidated by Manet, but this gruff Provençal young man, Paul Cézanne. And there he depicts him, and what irked Stock was his portrait that he'd painted of Achille Empereur, you can see there, as a second Napoleon, if you like. And there he portrays Cézanne as a madman, a wild man with a witch's hat and a wild stare. Cézanne shot back with a letter to the editor of the newspaper where this was published, really venting his spleen in no uncertain terms. But it was now 1870, and the Franco-Prussian War was about to start, and war clouds were gathering. Cézanne's father urged him to come down to the south because they didn't know what was going to happen. And there, feeling the mood of the time, Cézanne paints this landscape here, snow melting in winter time once the war had started. And why the sky is so black is because the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War was greeted by jubilation in the streets of Paris, for at last the French can put these uppity Prussians down. That was the thinking. But just in a matter of weeks, of course, the Prussian forces swept across eastern France, and by that winter of 1870, Paris was under siege and the population on the verge of starvation. So much so that Napoleon III then had to entreaty Bismarck for favourable conditions for a surrender. Cézanne, sensibly, Pissarro hot-footed it across the Channel and sat out the Franco-Prussian War in London, as did several other artists. But then once he came back, he knew about Cézanne, knew that he was having a difficult time, and he said, I'm living just outside Paris, some 30 kilometres to the northwest, in a little town called Pontoise. If you had time and the inclination, why don't you come by and perhaps we can paint together, and just for your own interest. What he was trying to do was encourage this young man with promise to see what he can really achieve. Cézanne, meanwhile, was living with his model mistress, Hortense, and that she'd already given birth to a son, Paul Jr. So the three of them arrive, not staying with Pissarro, but in the neighbouring village of Auvers-sur-Oise, just along the bank of the river. And there they spent 2 years together on and off, with Cézanne learning at the feet of the 9 years older master Pissarro, looking up to Pissarro as very much a father figure. And Pissarro shows him some of his work. He said, this is what I'm doing, and you can see it's typical Pissarro, lots of little dabs. It's an orchard in blossom there, a hillside with some houses on the top. And he says, go and see if you can find something and show me what you're doing, and I'll be happy to comment if you wish. And then Cézanne finds in Auvers-sur-Oise a similar sort of hill with just one tree with a bit of blossom, and he rather copies his style, as you can see, little dabs of white paint there. And then Pissarro shows him another work. He said, this is quite interesting. Do you see what I've done here? There's an area of interest. There's a wall, but there's a gap, and you can see beyond it. And Cézanne liked the colouring there of green and beige and cream. He went off to see if he can find something similar. And there he does, not a gap in a wall, but a curving road, as you can see, in a gap. And this house on the left there, very much in Pissarro's style, happened to be known as the House of the Hanged Man, and nobody in the village could recall who the hanged man was, but that was the name of the house. And this painting, Pissarro looked at and said, this is good stuff. Put it in an exhibition, and in the next year's Salon des Indépendants, it sold for $300. And that was Cézanne's first sale. But Cézanne was very conscious he doesn't want to imitate the master, though he respected Pissarro hugely. He went off to try to develop his own style, and then in Auvers-sur-Oise he found this little road bending round, and at the end there you can see slightly towards the left a white towered building with a pink chimney top. And that was the house of the eccentric physician Dr. Paul Gachet. Dr. Paul Gachet, of course, is famous for reassuring Vincent van Gogh a year or two later that there's nothing wrong with you, my boy, that good food, fresh air and exercise won't cure, whereupon Van Gogh went out into a field and shot himself. Pissarro paints this affectionate portrait of a very wild and woolly looking Cézanne, really as a gesture of affection towards his young protégé. Interestingly, he's put in the portrait Achille Emperor's picture there, which always seems to be a motif. So Paul now goes back south. He's feeling confident enough, and Pissarro's lasting advice to him, parting advice, was when you look at a scene, look at the first impression that you have and try to capture that first impression, but also I recommend you keep your palette nice and light. And so he went back, and here back in Provence he does this patchwork quilt here. It's as though he looked at the scene, blinked, and then on his canvas, almost without looking at the scene again, put in the little patches of yellow and ochre and beige and the green. And interestingly, he's added, out of respect to his friend Zola, can you see the blue rectangle slightly up there above the half on the left-hand side? That's a reservoir built by Émile Zola's father, who was an Italian civil engineer. So he puts that in just as a little affectionate note. He also develops a little clientele now, and this is Victor Choquet, who's just a middle-ranked civil servant who spends all his money on buying art of young artists. And he starts buying up Cézanne's paintings as they come off, as the paint dries, and out of respect to Choquet, Cézanne offers to do this portrait of him. This is submitted at the Salon, and of course it's panned because his hair is green, and it shouldn't be green, so the critics said. But interestingly, we can see now how Cézanne is building up his painting. Can you see that the hair, if we look at the hair at the top there, he applies little dabs, little diagonal dabs of paint, green, grey, blue, and he's building up his, because what's going through his mind is he hasn't found himself yet. All these are trials and error. But he's beginning to find himself now. He's looking for a unifying structure. Here, we can see the same diagonal stripes there in his beard. So he goes back now. He's living with his parents, but meanwhile, he's got his mistress Hortense and young Paul who's growing up, and he knows that his father will cut his allowance completely if he discovers that he has a mistress and a son. So he secretes her away in a little village on the Mediterranean coast not far from Aix, and here they are in the now fully restored Jardin de Bouffin grand manor house, the former provincial governor's residence now restored. And this is, so he now starts painting, again under Pissarro's influence, you can see. It has 37 acres of farmland, it has flower beds, it has an ornamental pool, which he depicts. Most interestingly, it also, particularly in winter, when the trees are bare, has a view of Mont Sainte-Victoire, which will dominate his later years. And here we see the view that Cézanne painted through the bare chestnut trees. And he paints the house itself. The house is perhaps a little less pretentious than perhaps you might have been thinking, or I was thinking. And there it is, an 18th century house. And what is interesting, he's done something a little bit peculiar here. The house is tilted upwards, which of course it wasn't. As if the house is trying to reach the sun. And furthermore, if you look where the shuttered windows are open, the middle story windows there are black, because that's where his father's bedroom is. He goes out on excursions and starts painting Mont Sainte-Victoire because it's the obvious landmark, and he does so very much in the traditional classical landscape style that we saw yesterday with Claude, framing with a tree on either side, although he does it in his own way, of course. And so he respects the landscape tradition, but he tries to exclude anything that resembles modernity. He has to acknowledge the presence of a railway viaduct, there on the right you can see, but he colours it exactly the same colouring as the mountain, as if it's an integral part of nature. And then suddenly, something clicks in his head. He's out for a walk up one of the tributaries of the river nearby, and he comes across this scene with dappled light. And at the back of his mind is Pissarro's admonition, capture your first impression of what you see. And there he tries. And there are a lot of things in there in lots of different layers. It's a three-dimensional scene, of course, but he's just blinked and then captured it. We've got a tree in the foreground on the left that goes right up from the bottom to the top. And then we've got a three-part bridge, part iron, as you can see, part stone on either side, water underneath reflecting the bridge, trees, and a house over to the left as well. But somehow it's all blending together because of that first impression admonition. And he's using now his diagonal little strokes of paint, which in a way unites each element. And this is probably the beginning of the mature Cézanne, although he may not have appreciated it at the time. There was also, he tries it again a little bit further up the river, perhaps not quite so successfully, but now emphasizing the unity of his brushstroke, a diagonal stroke for all the trees, the bank, the reflections in the river, more horizontal in the river than on the trees themselves. He's looking for a unifying way of bringing all these elements of this picture together, not focusing on this house done perfectly, this tree done perfectly, but somehow trying to unite everything. Interestingly, the view he's chosen has a large house on the right there with red shutters, can you see? And that is the house now of Émile Zola, who is a highly successful novelist. Wealthy, with now an art collection including several of Cézanne's paintings, and he likes to have open house, a bit like we saw Turner with Fawkes inviting the young painters, give him a little bit of prestige, and they like to come. So Zola invites a lot of circle of friends to come and spend the weekends with him. Among his circle of friends, of course, is Paul Cézanne, and Paul is always welcome to come any of his open houses for the weekend, and he goes on many occasions. But there's a problem, because Cézanne is a law unto himself. He's gruff, he can be rude, he can ignore you, he speaks with this very sort of earthy accent, and he often says Zola has frequently to placate his guests because Cézanne has been rude to them. But he's forgiving. He's, after all, his school friend and his best buddy. But things change. And why they change is because Zola's new novel is called L'Œuvre, which has many translations, but work of art, if you like. He calls it L'Œuvre. And L'Œuvre features, as the subject of this novel, an artist, Claude Lantier. He's the protagonist of the novel, who is modelled almost to the T on Paul Cézanne. His short build, his stocky physique, his beard, his gruff Provençal accent, and his gnawing sense of failure that he's never going to make it as an artist. So much so that at the end of the novel, Lantier commits suicide. Insensitively or not, Zola sends Cézanne a copy. And as Cézanne starts reading, he's flattered. Oh, well, it's very nice. My great friend Zola has really made it, and here I am. But as he read on, he got more and more anxious. He felt that his great buddy and friend and brother had betrayed him. He sends a letter, having received the book. My dear Émile, I have just received L'Œuvre, which you were good enough to send me. I thank the author for this kind attention of remembrance and ask him to permit me to clasp his hand whilst thinking of bygone years. What a moving letter. The two of them never met again. Hortense, meanwhile, his mistress, mother of his child Paul, was a 19-year-old, long, lanky, rather characterless individual who was happy to pose for him for portraits. And she was about the only person who was happy to pose for him, apart from Victor Choquet, for portraits, because he was a notoriously slow and demanding painter, and his model had to sit absolutely motionless and absolutely in silence for hours at a time. And you can just see from her expression that seemed to fit the bill quite well. And he painted her here, the only time he ever painted her outdoors, and he never ever painted her wearing being anything than fully clothed. And the reason for that was, way back when he was in the Académie Charles Suisse in Paris, learning the basics, part of the requirements there for trainees with Charles Suisse, with a view to getting into the École des Beaux-Arts, was they had to do human figure painting, which of course included nude women. And Cézanne realized then that this caused him enormous physical and mental anguish. He just couldn't do it. And he had this sort of fixation about the nude woman. And for that reason, if only, all her pictures are fully clothed. And here she is out in the garden. It's actually sunshine. And if you now look at her, she's after all the mother of a young boy. You might even be forgiven for thinking that she could possibly be happy. And here he paints her again, back inside the house. And there's something uneasy about this. Portraiture for Cézanne is nothing to do, it's the complete antithesis of Rembrandt, as you can see. He's not remotely interested in personality, psychology of the subject. What he is interested in is structure. Here, look at the way he's posed her. He's posed her immediately in front of the join between the wall at the back there with the brown wallpaper with the blue motifs and the door, which is partly ajar in grey-blue to the right. And you can see she's lined up absolutely centrally down that. Can you see the parting in her hair? It runs down from the join between the wall and the door, through the parting of her hair, along her nose, and down the row of buttons on the front there. For Cézanne, portraiture really seems to be a study of an object to be analysed. And that's a strong statement to make, and I'm in a friendly audience, I sense. I was at an exhibition in the States not long ago of Cézanne's portraits and they're extolling all the this, that, and the other. But to me, it's an object to be analysed. And I think I'll show you why. Here's another portrait, this time of his housekeeper. And here's the housekeeper sitting in the kitchen, and you can see she's sitting against a wall with lots of pictures on the wall there, or whatever. And she's got a blouse on. Can you see the collar that she's got? It's almost like a clerical collar, a smooth collar that meets in the midline. And then running down the middle of her blouse, a line, and then round her waist, I guess that's an apron, not the continuation of her dress, but an apron she's got around her waist with a tie. Can you see that? And then as you follow the apron down, it's got a cleft in a ridge. And now I'm going to draw your attention to the cafetière on the table on the right of the picture. The lid seems somehow to parallel the collar of her blouse. The waistband that she has of her apron, the waistband of the cafetière. The flared lower part of the cafetière, even down to the little fold of the handle there, seems to me. I don't know whether I'm reading too much into this, but anyway, let me just. There we are. So, man, woman as object rather than woman. More portraits. I mean, he does dozens and dozens of her because nobody else will sit for him. And here's Hortense in a social occasion at home. And they're really, you can see from the position of her fingers and her hands that the relationship is not going well. So much so that, in fact, it's not long after this portrait was painted that she goes to Paris, taking Paul with her, and they become estranged. At that point, just before that point of formal separation, Cézanne was always putting her down. They were not married, this was his mistress, but they would have guests at home, and she would try to sort of interject a little bit into the conversation to show she wasn't a complete dummy. And Cézanne would turn round and say, "Oh, my dear, you don't know what you're talking about," which is rather sad. And then, as an aside to another guest, he said, "All she's interested in is Switzerland and lemonade." It's a sort of witty little quip, but if you're the victim of that, it's rather cruel, I think you would agree. And it gives you some idea of the psyche of this solitary man bound up in his own ambition to be a successful painter, but full of self-doubt. And about this time, let me just say that they did in fact marry, even though she was living in Paris. They came together for a marriage in order that their son Paul, who was technically illegitimate and couldn't inherit, could indeed inherit. And to Cézanne's surprise, his dominating father actually came to the wedding. Came to the wedding, but 6 months later, dropped dead. Cézanne surprised himself with how much he missed his father. It had been, after all, the first half of his life. And he recalls in the Aix Museum of Art seeing this sensitive 18th century portrait of a young girl doing some sewing. And he paints the maid of the house in the Grand Jardin de Buffon, maid there. He paints her now as an old lady with her rosary. And this is, as far as I'm aware, the only religious painting that Cézanne ever did. But interestingly, after that, he returned to his Catholic ropes. He'd never been practicing, but he did, in fact, now attend Mass on a regular basis. So this relationship with his father, however poisonous it seemed, clearly affected him to his core. Now he does something completely different. He's experimenting now with colour. And here he paints this picture. This was also in the museum that I saw of portraits, and I read the caption. I always read the captions. And I just couldn't agree at all. What he's painted here, the red jacket, as you can see there, it's patches of colour. He's just exploring the application of paint in big blocks of colour. And here he's not remotely concerned that this young boy he's painted, who's resting his hand, or his head on his hand there, he's not remotely concerned that the forearm he's resting his head on is as thin as a matchstick, which is completely absurd, of course. Nor does he seem remotely concerned that the arm on the other side is much, much too long. And I was completely stumped why the caption didn't mention those two things at all. But that's the reverence of museums, I suppose, for artists who are demigods. When asked about this picture at the time, Cézanne sort of made a little whimsical quip, and he says, well, the reason I never got into the Beaux-Arts was I could never get my proportions right. And here with colour again, he's reading about colour theory, and he reads that if you paint something red, it tends to advance towards you, something blue will recede. And here he's experimenting with this harlequin, a theme that Picasso would take up for other reasons. And again here, he did many card players. These are quite well-known paintings now, distributed in the major museums, a series of 4 or 5 card players. And here's one. Again, it's an exercise in colour and distance, perspective. He's interested in that. Because if you look at the wall at the back, it's maroon, reddy brown. Can you see that it's in a bar? And the table itself is a sort of tannish red. And because the table is lighter than the darker distance, the table seems to be projecting towards us. The 2 card players are wearing different coloured jackets. One on the left there is dark, the other one on the right is light. And I think you would agree, certainly it strikes me, that the man wearing the light jacket seems to be a little bit nearer to us than the other one smoking the pipe who's receded a little bit into the distance. But if you actually step it out, they are both in exactly the same distance from us. So he was exploring not only the effects of reds and blues for forward and backward projection, but also just tone, dark or light tone of each colour having the same effect. And now he turns his attention to still life. If his portraits are essentially animated still lifes, because that's how he seemed to be conceiving of them to my mind, how did he actually deal with real still life? And back in the Louvre, he was very taken by this Chardin painting. And Chardin's still lives are still admired hugely today, because Chardin's thinking in doing a still life was not just to record the presence of a pewter tankard, some apples in a bowl, and some chestnuts. It was to give dignity to each item that he painted. And I think you can see where he's going. The pewter cup there stands proud as a pewter cup. Furthermore, here we want to get inside the bowl because it's illuminated, and we're curious to know what that spoon is actually sticking in. So the dignity of the object. And then a century later, we have Courbet, also an expert at still life, but something completely different. Here we've got some apples in a bowl, but they're all a sort of bit weather-beaten, aren't they? They're puckered, they've got some wormholes in them, they're scarred, they're all irregular shaped. And he's placed them in an earthenware, handmade earthenware bowl, which is also irregular. And for Courbet, it isn't the dignity of the object, the reason for doing the still life, but it's more to demonstrate the harmony and the earthiness of nature. Nature producing apples, nature producing the earth from which the bowl is made. And I think you can see where he's coming from. And this is the thinking that's behind still life. Cézanne does still lifes, and then the question is, well, what motivated him to do still life? And what motivated him, having done his experiments with colour and shade for push and pull, front and back, for him it's all about perspective. Here is one of his early still lifes. He's not concerned about minute detail and making it all look like a perfect apple. That didn't matter to him. But what did matter was the way he's arranged these objects with respect to the wallpaper at the back. Can you see there? And the wallpaper at the back has got some leaves on it, vine leaves or whatever. And the leaves would seem here to me to be almost leaving the wallpaper and trying to join in the fruit bowl here. And in a way, I make the point exaggeratedly, but I think you can see what I'm getting at. And similarly with the glass. Can you see the glass has no colour? By definition, it's transparent. We see the wall behind it, so the glass is now almost emerging into the wall. So we're beginning to get a little bit uneasy about perspective. It's not gross, and you can ignore it if you so choose, but there's something there that's catching his eye. And now he goes a step further. Here he's arranged 2 bowls of fruit, can you see? There's some apricots on the right there, and the bowl seems to be lying flat on the table. We're a little bit above the scene, so we can see the projection of the table there, not absolutely end-on, but a little bit above. But everything looks quite right. There's nothing there that jars. But look at the angle of this plate here on the right, and the cherries there. And what worries me is why haven't the cherries started to slide onto the floor? And now he does the same thing again, but more so. Now we're not really conscious of the shelf on which these objects are placed. The first thing that strikes me is this vase of green at the back there seems a little bit too big. I mean, it could have been a big vase, but it all seems a little bit out of proportion, but that's neither here nor there. But what is interesting, as we look at the vase, we're looking at the front of the vase exactly as you would expect, but simultaneously we're looking inside the vase. We can actually see inside, and you can't really see two planes in one go. So already he's playing with this concept of spatial arrangements. And now look at this plate of apples on the side here. One apple has indeed fallen out, can you see? And next to it is a sugar bowl. And my question is, why hasn't the sugar bowl and why hasn't the apple crashed onto the floor? Because they should have. And now he really gets us thinking. He does this still life. And now he really makes us think, what are we looking at here? At the very top, we've got a chair. Is it on the floor or is it on the bed? We're not quite sure. Here we've got a ginger jar. Can you see the ginger jar there, open-ended? It's quite large. But let our eye follow the edge of the table. Can you see the table on which it's resting? Let's just take our eye up on the left-hand side of the table and then bring it across horizontally towards the right, behind this big jar with the lid on. And the back of that table would seem to be almost at the beginning of where the ginger jar is resting. So what is the ginger jar resting on? It's not resting on anything. It's sort of suspended in space. And just to make the point, he says, well, if you didn't get that, surely you'll get my point with this basket of fruit. Here's a big basket of fruit, and as you look at it straight end on, absolutely fine, nothing wrong with that at all, basket of fruit. But then look where it is in respect to the back of the table. 3/4 of the basket of fruit is actually beyond the table. Not only that, look at the front edge of the table, the very front edge. Starting off at the left side, it then disappears behind this white napkin, and then suddenly it jumps up. So why does he do all this? Is he a clown? What is it all about? And what he's trying to do is to make us all appreciate each individual object for its own worth and not be locked into a stereotypic picture that we look at a table with a ginger jar basket and whatever and just blink and say, oh, well, that's just that, and move on to the next picture. He engages us to think about things. He's deliberately trying to destabilize us. So this is how his mind is working. As I said, he had this phobia of ladies, but he did have in his collection of prints this Titian print of this painting of Titian's, in which two nude women are there, some musicians in costume on a hillside. Lovely picture. I'd just draw your attention to the lady on the left of the screen there and look at the angle of her arm. Can you see it's bent at the elbow upwards and her wrist is bent downwards as she's pouring water from a jug into a well? And I suspect he used this as a model for his series of bathers. He certainly didn't employ nude models, that's for sure. And there we've got not a woman pouring water down a well, but a figure standing up, still draped with a bit of a towel across, can you see? And you see how her elbow is bent up there, the tall one standing, elbow bent, and her hand is also draping down. So why did he paint this series of bathers? He did dozens of bathers. Why did he do this? And I'm not quite sure. It took me a while to understand why he did this. And I think what he's doing here is recognizing that we're all part of nature, a holistic view of the world. And what he's done, can you see the woman standing on the left there with the long hair going down her back there? This is certainly not erotic, I think we agree on that. It's certainly not sublime, it's not a Titian nude. It's not telling a story as far as we can tell. It's just four women in nature. And to bind them to nature, he's positioned them in such a way that the back of the lady standing there with her long hair matches the foliage going down to the left of her. And similarly, the legs of the lady standing match the chair here. But more than just the posture, it's the colouring. Can you see it's dappled light? Dappled light. We've got blue of a little pool here, or a stream on the bottom right here. We've got blue at the back. We're not sure if that's sky or not. Probably is. But the same blue that appears in the sky and in the water there is the shadowing on the bodies. And so now we can see where he's coming from. He's beginning to blend man, woman, and nature in one, a sort of harmonious whole. He did hardly any male nudes, and there's certainly nothing remotely homoerotic about this picture. It's more reminiscent of the weekends he used to spend with Bai and Zola, when they were at high school together at the lycée, they used to spend the weekends together fishing and swimming, and I think this is recording that memory. But I didn't mention at the time that when the three of them were regarding themselves as the great intellectuals of this Duffers school, they were actually very, very smart young men, and the three of them in the evenings after school classes would discuss art, literature, philosophy, and they would read to each other poems they had written in Latin. So these are highly intelligent young men, and Cézanne, for all his gruff exterior, was highly intelligent as well. And I think that's a reminiscent of that time. And here, again, he's now concentrating not only on the colouring, but the way he creates the picture to blend man. When I say man, it's the old-fashioned generic Homo sapiens, woman with nature. And he's doing so not just by posture, which is more obvious here. You can see the tree in the back lining up. This bendy tree here is corresponding to the girl up to her thighs in water there. Not only in posture, not only in colouring, but now in brushstroke. Can you see how almost everything in this picture is now done with little short brushstrokes, most of them angled? You see that particularly in the foliage of the tree on the right there, going off into the background, the horizontal brushstrokes in the water. And it's like there's a theme binding them all together. And these brushstrokes are how he builds up his image. As I said right at the very beginning, he's interested in the structure of nature, whether it's the structure of the human body, not in Michelangelo terms, but in cellular terms, if you like. Each brushstroke is like a cell building up an organism. And you can see that coming together. And if we think back to that scene where the iron bridge and the stone and the reflection in the wood, where he was seeing it all merging together, that is reminiscent of this picture, isn't it? How it's all beginning, it's a push and pull. He's decomposing the image in order to identify its basic structure, but at the same time bringing all the elements of the picture together, which we'll see to great effect shortly with Mont Saint-Victoire. Towards the end of his life, he did two very large bathers. And here it's a little bit different. We've got the colouring, we've got the angles of the body, so he's blending with nature, but nature's not quite as explicit here as before, is it? Probably rocks up the right side, a couple of trees. We're not sure what goes on in the background. But the colouring is striking. They're resting on an ochre-coloured slab of rock, and their colours match accordingly. But here they're beginning to segregate themselves off into two groups. Can you see there's a group of women on the left, group of women on the right? Are they all women? We can't be sure. Certainly the one sitting down with her head bowed on the right-hand side there looks distinctly androgynous, to me at least. So this is nothing to do with sex, it's nothing to do with eroticism, it's to do with the structure of a painting and man relating to nature. The two groups are separated by a little bit of a white cloth. Can you see right down in the bottom foreground, right in the centre there with some pieces of fruit? And then in his archive, in his studio, he had, as well as the Titian of the woman with her bent arm pouring water down the well, this picture here by Poussin, of the Feast of Pan. And it's a revelry taking place in a wood, and you can see somebody with the bugle there on the left side. I mean, this is all from 1600. So, but what is interesting is that they tend to be grouped in two clusters, one on the left, one on the right, and separating them is this what looks like a sort of, first I thought it was a human body, but in fact it's a crumpled up clothing fitted with a shoe at the bottom, and at the top, instead of a face, you've got a theatrical mask. And this is Poussin's jest, if you like, a sort of fête galante 1600 style. And I just wonder whether this was the inspiration for his final bathers pictures, which is this. And this, for the first time, does indeed look like it's a narrative, doesn't it? There's something going on, there's a story going on here, but we're not quite sure what it is. Like Poussin, and like the earlier big bather that we just saw, two groups of bathers on the left and on the right there, separate.